The next caller arrives.
All right. I don't know if I want to see myself like this. All right. All right. So thank you so much for coming to my presentation. I am going to speak about UI router and nested views and routing for AngularJS. Just show of hands, how many people have worked with Angular UI in some form or another already? Even in plunkers. All right. How many people are vaguely familiar with how the route provider works, with where you specify routes and then load things? All right, great. Because I am going to assume some pre-knowledge of that, since UI router kind of builds conceptually off of route provider. All right, so we are sponsored by Union of Rad. He bought all the pizza, so who am I? I'm Tim Kindberg. I work at Trivanis, which is an e-learning software company downtown, and we make e-learning software and learning management tools where you can upload courses and track completion statuses and pass and fail. It doesn't really matter if you fully understand what that means. If you are interested in those products, you can check them out later. And just some background of how I got to where I am, just maybe you can relate to me and my role over the years. I started as a graphic designer, became an e-learning course designer, a Flash animator. I've done Flash and Flex development. I've then done a lot of web UI and UX development, including mockups and Photoshop interface designs. And then lately, I'm obsessed with front-end web development and, of course, Angular, like we all are, or else we wouldn't be here. And by night, I'm a husband. I have 2 children. I am a founding member of the UI Router team, and then I also love to read, new articles about new tech. Just basically consume, consume, consume. I like to think of me as this guy. All right, I'm probably flying. I'm going a little too fast, I think. So the agenda is going to be, I'm going to tell you about UI Router's backstory. Then we're going to talk about the current option, ng-route module, that's already in the core. We're going to compare ng-route with UI Router so you can see how they differ. We're going to talk about how UI Router gives you nested states and the feature to do nested states. We're going to talk about what happens when a state is activated and how to activate it, and also attaching URLs to that state, giving it more of an ng-route functionality. And then multiple named views and abstract states kind of towards the end, because they're a little more advanced topics. Then we're just going to kind of glaze over the popularity and the challenges that the open source library has faced and what we're kind of working on next. And then the last slide is just some resource links for you to click later. I'll be sharing the slides with everyone. All right, so how I found Angular is probably a lot like how everyone found Angular. You have this project that may or may not be happening in the future, and you're researching different frameworks. So I found Angular, and to me, from the Flex world, it was more familiar and easy and fun. And then the other one that seemed to compete is Ember, which to me was unfamiliar and complex, at least compared to Angular, for me personally. I hear tons of good things. I know a lot of people who love Ember, so I'm not saying it's wrong for anyone. Just it was wrong for me. Except for one thing. Ember's routing is awesome. I mean, you can nest as much as you want, as deeply as you want, I think. I don't think there's any limit there. And with Angular, you have sort of this single view mapped to routes, okay? But with Ember, you have unlimited nested views mapped to nested routes. So it's kind of like the picture showing. You have 2 robots with Angular, and then as many as you want with Ember. You can literally just put one ng view in your app and swap content out with it. With Ember, you can have nested everything and swap just the ones you need to swap when you need to swap them. So this is kind of how I felt when I looked at both staying with the robot theme. I was wondering, were other people feeling like me? So I kind of went out on the internet and I was thinking of what I should search, nested Angular views, something like that. And yes, I did discover people were feeling the same, but nothing actually existed yet. I only found a GitHub discussion on the matter, and it was backed by Angular UI, the people who also make the Angular UI components. And I started kind of giving my 99 cents about like we should do a lot like Ember. You know what I mean? And if people kind of agree with that. Some developers were contributing partial solutions, and we were kind of shooting them down because they just weren't elegant enough. And then came along a, um, a guy named Karsten Sperling from New Zealand, and he submitted sort of his half-baked idea. And he actually had a lot already done. It was quite complex. So I reviewed it, and it was dead on, I think, what we needed. So we started shaping the initial API, and you can click that link right there if you want to see the whole first discussion. It's a very, very long GitHub um, issue. And then we released version 1 on May 24th. But I think we actually were working for about 4 months before that. And it's open source, so we weren't making a lot of progress. It was, nights and weekends and not many of them either. So just real quick, credit goes to much smarter people than me for this library. Karsten Sperling delivered the original code base. He's sort of the father of UI Router. And then Nate Abel, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He sort of took the torch after Karsten kind of dropped off, and he became the lead developer and is continuing to be lead developer. Myself, I help with issues. I field issues and help them get fixed. I create all the docs and the readmes and the wiki and the FAQ. And then some other contributors, Gemme, E.A. Hutchins, Stu Salisbury, and Pro Loser, who help with pull requests or just hashing out ideas on how to shape the API. And obviously, any of you could jump on and contribute, if you'd like. All right, so let's look what is currently available. Just touch on it real quick. Igor? We met with Igor once, and he basically gave us his seal of approval and a promise to look at it in the future at some point. And I'll touch on that at the end. So route and route provider, that comes out of the box with Angular. And that was part of the core library before. In 1.2, they're actually going to separate it out into their own module, but it's still provided to you by the core team. And basically what you get is you get a single level of nesting. So here's your index HTML. Maybe you have a header at the top. And you put your ng view on the page, and that's going to swap content out dynamically based off the URL. So if you go to home or contacts, it'll change what's populating that ng view. And if you want to do anything more complicated than that, you have to use other directives supplied to you in conjunction with state params, usually, or just logic that you might have, custom logic. And so that can be kind of rigid. So then UI Router's approach is state and state provider, and URL router provider, which is kind of like a tertiary service that the module provides. And even though we call it UI Router, it's actually the idea of states. We just named it UI Router because we knew that's the word people were going to be looking for. But it uses the idea of states instead of routes. So let's look at how they are similar and how they are different. So states versus routes. A state is a place within your app. If you define a place within your app, I want this here, that there, and this is the way it looks when I'm at this place. Whereas a route is really a URL within your app that kind of triggers a place. A state can have nested hierarchy, whereas a route is a flat hierarchy. A state, the name of a state is actually a name, so home or contacts details, whereas the name of a route is a URL. So you get more explicitness with the name of states. To navigate to a state, you can use the name of it or the URL that's associated with it. With routes, you navigate via URL. States give you multiple views, not only nested within each other, but they can live at the same level. And you can have multiple, as many as you want, living at the same level, and then those can have nested with them as well. And routes, you get one view, the single view, ng view. Oh, by the way, ours is called UI view. States can populate any view. So when you activate a state that's nested, you can populate any view from there up. In a route, you populate the one view that you have. With states, the state is actually responsible for populating the parts or the quadrants on your screen. Whereas in routes, you're responsible for doing that based off the state. Obviously, the route will populate the ng view, but beyond that, you're responsible. All right, so a lot is actually the same between the two. If you wanted to use state provider as a direct replacement, you could do that. It's kind of pointless, but you could do that. And if you look, you can see there's a URL declared here, whereas up here you just declare it as kind of the name or the first parameter. You have template URL, controller, and resolve. The only noticeable difference is that the state. Oh, where's my pink? I was hoping it would highlight pink. But it uses contact.detail. When you're in edit mode, it highlights pink. That's really nice. So again, the similarities, you can associate a URL, which is optional in UI Router. Template URL can assign a controller, can resolve dependencies before the controller instantiates. But you can redirect using when, and you can handle invalid URLs with otherwise, and you can also have URL parameters. And the parameters are actually, you don't need a URL to use parameters, but that's typically the way you'll do it. Real quick, the difference of the when method. So in ng-route, this is actually the main method that you're going to use to add routes. In 1.2, it's going to change to the name route. But in UI Router, it's actually a much lesser method. It's just for creating URL redirects. So you're going to use it much less. It's just named the same. So when you want to use when or otherwise with UI Router, you actually have to inject URL router provider into your config in addition to state provider. And then you would do it like this. So you can see the when is really just going to redirect /user/ID to /contact/ID. So you're really, it's when is just used for setting up aliases or redirects. And then otherwise works pretty much the same. You're just saying if I don't hit a valid URL, then redirect to just /. And of course, you need to add it. This is kind of just for later when people are watching the slides. You need to set UI Router as a module dependency and then add the script to your head. All right, so nesting, we're going to talk a lot about nesting because that really is the main feature here. That's why people started the discussion in the first place, and it's the feature that people look for when they realize they can't use ngView to do that. So everyone in here probably understands that your app consists of components within components within components. You like that? So what you can do is you can actually let your state views describe that nesting, that natural nesting that occurs within your apps. And I'm going to call them pieces. I'm going to call them quadrants. I don't really know what to call them, but just the different parts of your page that make up one place within your app. So for example, you might have a form within a field, within a panel, a list view, inside of a page, inside of a site. So these are things, not that everything needs to be described with the state, but a lot of it can be, at least the highest level things can be. So those are just states within states within states. Am I moving too fast or too slow? Good. I feel like I'm going a mile a minute. All right. So a typical use case, um, you have your main page, your header at the top, and you want to show a list of contacts. And so you could use UI view and sort of populate that with a list. And then maybe when I click on one of those people in that list, to the right, I want to show some detail about that person. And so with State Provider, you would just nest a UI view inside of the other UI view, and you'd go to a deeper state. So you're nesting the templates and the states at the same time, and I'll show that. And then maybe when you click edit address below their information, you want to pop up a field where you get to then edit that information. So it shows you kind of how the nesting occurs. And actually, I have this open already. So this is the demo app that's built. If you go to the GitHub repo, this is what you'll find is the demo app. And it's actually, it pretty much shows off every feature. It's not the simplest demo, but it is pretty simple. I think it's easy to understand if you wanted to go explore the code. What you see is this sort of the welcome screen. And then down here, you can pay attention. It's going to show us what state we're in, if there's any state params, and then the full URL that was specified in the config, not the one that's going to appear up here in the URL. And then you'll also want to keep an eye up in the URL to see how it changes. So if I go to contacts, oh boy, I'm running this off in nitrous. I don't know if that's why it might break. All right, let me just go to the one posted online. What key do I hold to open a new tab? I'm not a Mac user. I like right buttons. I know that's dumb. All right, so now we're at contacts, and we've gone to the contacts list state. And what you didn't see, which I'll explain later, is that we've actually implicitly also activated the contact state by activating the child of it called contacts.list. And now, this is not one-to-one to my example on the slides, but it's pretty close. So if I click Alice, I'm going to go to her information, and you saw there was a little lag there. That's because it was resolving a dependency before it loaded that page. And what's that? I think it's simulated with a timeout. Okay, so I think it's just like 500 milliseconds or something like that. It's just a hard-coded JavaScript object to populate all this. And now we're in contacts.detail, so we've went to the sibling state of contacts.list, kind of moved sideways, if you will. And now if I click phone number, you can see that we're now in contacts.detail.item, so we're in a child of the detail state. We also have a couple state params, which is just exactly like URL params, or URL params. And if I hit edit, I switch to detail.item.edit. And so this is incredibly easy to do with State Provider. And this is so common when you're making applications. So how is that achieved? So, and we're going to dive in at various levels, so don't worry too much about the way the states are defined. So first off, I just want to, because this is something that at first, and we've had to rewrite the guides like a couple times because people just didn't get some concepts that we thought were obvious, and later we realized they weren't obvious. So the UI view of a nested state, it automatically knows to be populated, the template of a nested state automatically knows to be put into its parent's UI view. And if you come from Ember, that's how that works, right? Yeah. It just populates upward.
So the parent, so the children, parents don't know anything about the children other than they have children?
Yeah, they don't even know they have children, I don't think. And so basically, this kind of shows a little better. This is, if you think of top, middle, and top, middle, bottom, this is the parent, this is sort of the child, and this is the grandchild. So this UI, this template, even though it's just a UI view, I hope that's not confusing, is going to get put into this UI view. And then this template gets put into this one. And then this template, if it's a top level state, its parent is actually sort of an implicit root state whose template is your index.html, which then populates the top level UI view.
You have more than one.
What's that?
You have more than one outlet in the template.
Yes. Yep. And I'm going to talk about that. Actually, one of the last things I'll talk about, because that causes a lot of confusion for people. And it also leads to a lot of anti-patterns, unfortunately. People start putting everything into views when they should just merge them. All right, so the dot, that's how baby states are made. I thought that was funny. If you use the dot, so home and contacts, they're not using a dot. These are top-level states. Their templates are going to populate the root UI view that lives in index.html. But then contacts.detail, UI router knows that contacts.detail is a child of contacts without you doing anything. We just do that behind the scenes. And you can go as deep as you want, and you can have 100 dots between 100 names. I know some of you are probably like, well, that would get annoying, and I'll talk about that in a second. Whoa, gestures. So here's how the sample app sets it up. You can see there's a contacts, and I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty. I just want you to focus on the state name right now. They had contacts, and I just will point out, actually, abstract true. That means when any of its children get activated, it implicitly gets activated. And I'll go into that in more depth, but it's just kind of interesting to know for now. So then contacts.list, that's going to be a child of contacts, like we learned. Contacts.detail is also a child of contacts, a sibling of contacts.list. And then you can see it just keeps getting deeper and deeper. This is item is a child of detail. I mean, if you wanted to, you could really just call this state detail item or something like that in your head. And then item.edit. So that's how the sample app is set up.
So you're saying the child state, you have to know about the hierarchy where you're going to map it into, as opposed to setting up the state individually.
You are, and I think there's going to be a lot of ways around that. Which, for example, on the next slide, I'm going to talk about doing object-based states, and you can lazy load states. You can define child states before their parents.
I just think if you get more views, you can define the child independently and be able to add it.
I think you might be able to do that. Wait for this very next slide after this one, and then we'll have another little chat. So the dot is actually optional. The dot is optional here, and so if you don't feel like doing a lot of dots, which is not that bad if you only nest about 4 or 5 deep, but you can use a parent property instead. So, for example, you can see here's the contacts. Here's the contact state, and then here's list. Can you guys see my mouse? Probably not at all. And then it's declaring that its parent is going to be contacts and it's passing that in as a string. And so you could maybe change the parent dynamically, something like that. And then I think even better though is going to be this, where you declare them as objects beforehand. I guess you still have to do the parent. It only has to know about its parent though. And maybe that's a great reason for you to go contribute to the open source project and submit a pull request. Follow the dev guidelines, or else otherwise Nate will yell at you. So you can declare objects beforehand, and this is actually a lot more popular than we were expecting. So you have to declare the name inside the object if you're not going to do it the previous way I was just talking about. So here we said, name is contacts, name is list, and then the parent is contacts. And notice this time we're actually passing a reference to the object, not the name. And UI Router is pretty friendly with using the object alternative in that you can pass the object in different to different methods. Like there's one called state.is where you check if you're in a current state, and you can actually pass the object instead of the name of the object. And so that down here, when I'm declaring state provider.state, we're just passing in those pre-built objects at that point. All right, so inheritance. So when you have nested things, usually there's some sort of inheritance that happens. It happens with scope properties and methods. By default, you're used to that inheriting down the DOM, things like that. And you'll still get that with, when you have your nested UI views, you'll get that, but that's not really a feature of UI router. That's just Angular being Angular, and you can use that to your advantage. That's actually a big cause for confusion. That's why I have both a star and a cross. And I have like 3 special sections in the guide. Oops. Okay, so, but things that are UI router features that we actually coded into the module is resolved dependencies will inherit from parents to children, and then custom data will inherit down to children as well. So I'm going to touch on these real quick. I almost didn't even put them in, but because resolves are like their own talk, you know what I mean? I didn't want to go into resolves. And if you don't understand resolves, I urge you to learn more about them, both in the context of ng route, but also, and then in the context of UI router. So here we have a parent state, and it has a resolve called res_a, or a dependency called res_a, and it's going to return just an object. And these could be promises as well. I just didn't write my example that way. And then its child has a dependency called res_b that relies on res_a. So if I were to go directly to parent.child from somewhere else, it's going to wait for parent to resolve its dependencies first, and then it will resolve the child's dependencies. And then furthermore, you can inject those dependencies into controllers as well. You can see down here, this controller uses dependencies from its own state plus any ancestor. Does that make sense?
So the res_a going into the second one there is how it knows that it has resolved res_a before it goes to res_b.
Right. The fact that I used res_a, somehow it knows. Some genius named Nate made that work. I don't know how he did it.
So I would assume this is like where you would set up things like search call.
Yeah. It would be, it's amazing once you start using UI router, you'll find almost just so much of your application, it all starts there. Just like in Ember, it all starts with their router. I mean, it becomes the core of your product. And that's why I think having a talk about it and getting it more out there is important, because it really is a missing piece to Angular. And then inherited custom data. So again, I have parent and parent-child. The parent is declaring okay, so we had this thing where people were like, I want to just attach some custom data. And we're like, well, technically, the state config is just an object. You could just add things to it. And they were like, well, maybe we should just tell them, put it on data. Like, you're going to break the rules if you don't. Technically, you don't have to put it on data, but you should put it on data. Because we might break it later if you have your own thing. So we might add something. So we'll never touch data. You can put anything you want into that property. And so the parent is going to, in this example, is declaring custom data 1, custom data 2. And it's going to be hello world. And down here you can see I have a handler called state change start, and that's going to listen for when a state has been sort of entered or is about to transition. And when parent is activated, it's going to print hello world to the console. But then the child has data 2, and it's going to overwrite custom data 1. And so it's kind of like merged with all its ancestors' data. So when the parent.child is activated, it's going to print hello UI router. I don't really, I think that was just one of those things someone asked for and we did it. I don't know what you might use it for, but you can do it. All right, so I put this section in after practicing I think, twice, and realizing it could be helpful to know sort of what happens when a state is activated. Kind of behind the scenes, I'm going to walk you through pseudocode what happens. And it's a little cumbersome, and I didn't make graphics or anything funny. So we'll just go through it. So if I say I want to go to context.details, all right, what happens? So the first thing that happens, it's going to merge the options that you pass in with the default options. And you don't know about options yet, but you will. And then it's going to check if that state is even defined. Because if not, it's going to say, no, that one's not found. And that's a newish feature, because if it's not found, it gives one chance in the handler to define it then and there, and it's going to retry it one more time. And that's good for lazy defining of states if you want to load them kind of later. But that's much kind of really advanced thing that only a couple people are doing at the moment. Then it's going to merge all the parameters, so the URL parameters, with all the ancestor parameters. And it's going to get, okay, what's this state's parameters? Because unless you set options inherit to false. So I'll show you about the options object later. But there's several options you have when you activate a state. And then the important one, the reason why I even wanted to do this whole slide, was it's going to figure out what states are changing and which aren't. And now that I'm sitting with you very smart people, I don't know if I really need to explain that to you. It's not going to load the entire tree every time you change to a state. You know, if you go from A.B.C to A.B.D, it's only going to change the very child. It's going to leave A and B alone. If there's no changes, if you try to go to the same state with the same properties and everything, it's not going to transition. So you have a more efficient library in that regard. And then there's an option called options.reload. If you set it to true, then it will reload everything, even if it is the same state and options. At that point, it says, hey, I've started. I'm going to try to pick this up because everyone looks a little bored with this particular part. It's going to say, hey, I'm started. And at that point, you can, if you're listening to state change start, you can prevent the default, and it's going to stop. So, okay, I stopped. Thank you. All right, and then if you get past that, it's going to resolve all the locals. It's going to begin resolving all the locals for all the newly activated states, just the things that are changing. So once those locals are resolved, the real transition begins at that point. And at first it checks, maybe because it's using promises, maybe you called another transition while I was figuring out my resolve. So I'm going to check if something else has superseded me, and if so, I'm just going to kind of fizzle out and let the latest transition take place. It's going to run on exit for all the states that are sort of deactivating, and then it's going to run on enter for all the states that are sort of activating. Then it's going to update state params, make sure all these services are reliable for you to access and you can trust their values at that point. Update the location in the URL, and then it's going to say, I'm done, state change success. If you're listening to that, you can do something with it at that point.
So, real quick, so all the state changes that you might be kicking off, they just get keep at the end, or they...
No, when you call it, it'll start doing it. And if it's able to resolve its locals before you call another transition, it will start this list. But and it will finish it too, because JavaScript finishes what it starts, and then it'll start the new transition. But if you were to do multiple transitions all in one JavaScript cycle or whatever, it will take just the last one. Or even if you were transitioning to one that was having like a slow resolve, and then you did another one, it would basically see that it was superseded by the time it resolved its dependencies. So does all of that make sense while I take a drink? Sorry I don't have more cool graphics and jokes. I planned that right there. That was my joke. I have a little note down here. That went well. Okay, so So then activating a child state. So we're going to kind of run through an example of what happens based off what I just told you. So when you activate like a very deep state, it's going to activate any unactivated states from top to bottom. So let's say we jump right into an app via a URL of /contact/1/edit. And imagine we're kind of going into context.detail.edit. So first, it's going to activate this implicit root state that lives at the very top that you don't do. We make that for you. And then it's going to activate the contact state, activate context.detail, activate context.detail.edit. Right? And so from there, if we click contact 2, so we were at 1, now we want to click 2, what it's going to do, it's going to exit out of the edit state. It's going to exit out of contact detail because it's in the context 1 version of contact detail. Then it's going to sort of re-enter, reactivate the contact detail state, but with 2 as its new parameter. Well, it's pretty much ripped off Ember. I think I explained that at the beginning there. Yeah. Like I said, I loved Ember's solution, and as soon as Carson came along with his thing, and it reminded me of that, I just like cheerleadered the hell out of it, and we steamrolled the whole discussion. And other people were like, "I guess mine's not any good." And we're just like, "Pretty much." So we're doing this. So then, are you using Angular?
Well, yeah.
So you would probably really like this.
Yes.
All right, so no redundant work is done by just changing to like a sibling state, etc. And then real quick, I want to show you, how a callback is created. What time is it? 1907, Mike?
Subtract 12.
It's 21 o'clock. I know how to do that trick. 21 o'clock. No, it's 7 o'clock. All right, we're good. So yeah. All right, so here are the callbacks. I've specified an on enter and on exit, and I'm kind of just showing you template and resolve controller. I don't know why, to confuse you. And yeah, that's how you do it. I just want to show you that it's possible.
So in here, can you like reject a transition?
You should do that in an on state change start.
Okay, and you can say like if something doesn't exist.
Event prevent. You could do an event.prevent default, and it'll just stop everything. I think in here, I don't know. I feel like there was a bug, but we intended for on enter, if you were to call it transition, maybe say state.go, which I'll show you, then it would also work because you'd end up with the previous state being superseded. Which, so anytime you supersede a state, that's technically canceling the previous one as well. But if you just want to cancel it and stay where you are, you probably want to do it on state change start.
And you can redirect.
Yes.
On the on exit, you do like let's say like for our case, we can save data. That's the state. Put a condition there to save data if it wants to, but they can save before you transition out.
Oh, that's good. I don't think we have that in there where it prevents it from leaving. What it would do is you'd probably, anytime you want to prevent going to a different state because of something, either you want them to log in first or something like you said.
Save data. Like one of the things called save data, state and make changes.
Okay, so if you want to prevent them from going somewhere else, you'd still want to do it in on state change start. It might seem weird, but what you're basically saying is, as I'm starting to go to this other state, I'm going to check that they're allowed to first. But that might be a good point because you might have data related directly to this state that exists only when it's active or something. So that might be like you could create a new issue, a feature request or something like that. Oh, really?
Just hold it up.
How would I do that easily?
You're on an airplane, right? Over at the TV.
Yes.
It's really easy.
All right.
This one just spelled out the other one. Oh.
Will it just like kick mine off?
Yep. Oh, no. In big.
I want to see. Hey, I thought you were using UI router. Oh no, wait, those are just.
It's not command plus yet. Can't remember here.
I feel like it's big enough.
Oh, wait a minute. Yeah. So, whoops. So here, just inside of our run function on our main module, we've got a get current user, which actually isn't even being used anymore. And just a check allowed function to check if they have certain permissions coming in from the REST API with the current user account. And then down here at the bottom, we're just listening to the on state or the state change start event. And then we request the current user. If the user exists and we're going to this route, obviously send them there. That's to bypass the login screen if their session is still in cookies. But then right down here, if not check allow. So it's basically if they try to access a route that they don't have permission for, we can redirect them back to the main dashboard.
Here you go. Cool.
And there's a couple of UI route states up there.
Sweet. I think you're the only one using UI router at this point. How do I take back control here? I think that's incredibly useful, so thank you. Okay, so, and this kind of goes right along with what he was showing you. So the events that we broadcast at different times, there's going to be a state change start, and I'm kind of showing the parameters that go along with those. So you have access to the event, the to state, to params, from state, and from params. I'm only going to say that once. And then you can prevent the default on that state change or that event only. The rest are kind of already started and moving to prevent them at that point. State not found, that's great for lazy state definitions. State change success is when it's all done. Error is going to report any error that it ran into. I think even resolve errors, which some people have been whining about lately. And then view load events, you can, on your scope, you can listen to view content loading, and that'll pass in not only the event, but also the view config for that view. And the view actually emits that. And then view content loading.
Yeah, well, it would come out if the computer's beeping throughout. Oh, yeah, that's it's still being chimed.
I'm running out of maybe.
Click the little mute button. Click the speaker.
That?
Yeah.
Built-in output?
No, that would be by you. I thought that would be.
Just switch to telephone.
No way. Because I'm recording. I'm recording for, I'm going to want to maybe post this. I want it to hear me. Hello, hello, testing.
Just turn your volume. Yeah, just turn your volume.
Okay. I don't know why that was annoying everyone. Thought it was cool. Okay. So then how do you activate a state? So I taught you everything you need to know about what happens. And you're like, well, how do I activate it? So here's 3 ways to do it. State.go is one way. UISRef, which is sort of the answer to href or nghref. So sexy. And navigate, or you can navigate to the state's URL if you've associated one. So state.go, that's the programmatic way, and thanks to you and your example, you saw maybe a realistic way to do it, or a way to use it. So here I have a scope method called go to details, for example. I'm going to say state.go, contact.details, you pass in the name, then you pass in the parameters to populate sort of the URL parameters, because we're not going to it via URL. If you use ng-route, you're used to just putting that sort of in the view, and on an anchor you just actually put your parameters in there, or somehow you do it in some way that you invented, I don't know. And then, so that's going to populate, if there was an ID parameter in my URL that's associated with contact details, that's going to populate it with my variable called selected ID. And then a third one, which I'm not showing, is the options, the elusive options that I keep promising to tell you about. So the options are location, and I'm showing the defaults that, that these have as well when you use state.go. So location true. Yes, I want to update the URL when I go to the state. Inherit true. Yes, I want to inherit all the parameters from my ancestors. That sounds like a Lion King kind of thing. And then relative. So where am I going? I'm going to travel relative to my current state. And this is used for relative, like relative targeting, which I'll show you. And we'll have a little pop quiz. And then notify, true. Yes, I want to notify all the listeners that I am, transitioning. Reload, false. No, I don't want to reload, but you might want to, and then you can set that to true, and then it will load everything again. That was something we just recently added, so if you try to go get it tonight, you won't have that unless you build locally. So relative navigation, and I'm not going to read that because I decided I couldn't deliver it well enough. And then you use an up arrow to go upward, and you use a period to go down. And so I'll kind of show you what that means. So imagine this is our state tree that we've created. We have our root state at the very top, and we have 3 states below that, and then each state has 3 within it. And if we think of green as sort of where we're going to start, and blue where we're going to end up, and maybe the orange is in the middle, not for this example, but for other ones. So if you want to go to a parent, you can say state.go.up arrow, and that's just going to take you from, in this example, this state up to this one. If I did it again, I'd go up to the root. Okay, now if you want to go to a child, you would say state.go period, and now it's different when you go to a child because you could go to any child. Parent is easy. There's only one parent because it's asexual, and then it will go down to 3 in this case. Period 3. I think that's pretty straightforward.
Why is it that?
How do you mean three?
Period 3, imagine that my state's names are numbers. Okay, it could be period detail, period edit, if I'm going from detail to edit. You know what I mean? It's just like, maybe I want to go to a sibling, and in that case I'm starting here, I want to go here, so I use an arrow to go up, and a period with the name to go down to 1. Makes sense, right? So then this is absolute. So say I'm starting here, and I just don't use an up arrow or a period to begin with. If I just say the state's name, it's just going to start at the root and then travel the name of the state. So it's kind of different, but it just goes 3.3.
How do you define the order in which these states are? That's the third state. That's just the name.
That's just the name.
It's the name, yeah.
Okay.
So 2 people confused now. So sorry about that. Yeah. What?
Is this slower than using your parents' periods? Just call it out.
No, it's all the same speed. It's just you might figure that you want to use relative transitioning, and that actually goes back to your question, sir, about if you want to just define kind of a state on its own. In the future, we want to add sort of like componentized states that can It's a self-contained thing that never knows about anything except itself and maybe some children embedded in itself. You can just attach it anywhere in the state tree. And so you would then want to use relative transitioning for sure, because maybe you want to go to its parent, but not it doesn't want to know who its parent is. So it's kind of forward thinking with the whole relative thing. Oh no, oh crap.
We want to go directly to the root, just do state go. And then
You would just put the name of the state in. You wouldn't use an up arrow or a dot.
all the way to the top. Just do blank.
Oh, well, you wouldn't really go to the root ever, because the root's this implicit root state that we've set up. I think you could if you just said state go empty, then all your content would disappear. You'd probably want to go to your home state that you declared
Tim?
at the top level.
Tim?
Yeah, because this second row is really more the ones that you've defined. This R is the one that UI router set up before you ever did anything. All right, so this is just a crazy one. You would probably never want to do this. All right, so UI sref, again, these are awesome because this keeps your code really flexible. So stands for state reference or smart anchor. And so if you have an anchor called home, instead of doing href in the URL, you just say UI sref home if you want it to go to the home state. And you can change the URL anytime you want, and it'll still go to your home state all the time. Behind the scenes, if you have a URL associated, most likely you will, it's going to add the href for you during compile of that directive. I don't know. I think it might add just a pound sign or something, but actually I don't think it does. But we haven't had one complaint yet, and I think maybe that's just because everyone always has the URL associated with it. And when you click that, it will still use state.go behind the scenes, but the thing with the href that's nice is you can right-click and copy it. You can middle-click or command-click to open a new window, so it just gives you the extra features. You can also pass in parameters using this syntax. So you say UI sref, the name of the state you want to go to, and then inside of parentheses, and then you pass an object of your state params. And remember how I was saying you can inherit params from above? So say we're kind of real deep, and we're in the detail state, and we want to go to edit state. Instead of having to pass in every parameter to go down to edit, you just pass the ones that it's going to need in addition to the ones that already exist in your app currently. So that's kind of nice.
So in this case, if you're on post/1/,
Yeah.
you just say UI sref edit.
It'll know the one already is there. Unless you set inherit to false. And then you can also use relative targeting inside of UI sref. So if I want to go home, I can just put an up arrow. This is assuming I'm only in the template of a child of home. Because if you read the small text here, that can be a little confusing because it's going to be relative to the state that the link lives in. In other words, the one that loaded the template containing the link. So you just have to be a little careful using relative with UI sref. All right, so now it's 7:25. Wow, long presentation. I will officially start hurrying at this point. All right, so URLs. So in theory, you could make a UI router app that used no URLs. And actually, this is something that could be real for you. Maybe you're building something like a Photoshop in the cloud, and you just don't really need the URLs to match to the various layouts or this or that. So you could use Go and UI sref and never touch URL ever, in theory. So typically that won't happen. So adding URLs to your apps. You just say URL, and when they're nested URLs, meaning the state and the child, it's going to append automatically, again, like Ember. And so you're only defining the new bits that the child is adding to the overall URL. So the child ends up having a full URL of context/list. If you don't want to do that, then you prepend the URL with an up arrow. And this has nothing to do with relative transitioning, just so you know. It might be confusing, but that's how it is. Yeah? Oh, cool. Ah, fuck you. Hello, Nate. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Are
Nice.
you able to continue to listen to my bad jokes, and then we will uh, kind of pull you in at the end?
Sure, whatever you want to do, man.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to mute this now. Very cool. Uh-oh. What was that? Are we still recording? Good. All right, so if you think about it, this is actually really powerful because this means now you've sort of unsynced your URL from the nestedness of your state. And you can do this all over the place. You don't have to nest the UI views the same as your states are nested, the same as your URLs are nested. You can kind of do whatever the hell you want. You can give a grandchild a top-level URL. You can give a grandchild a top-level UI view even. You don't have to populate the nested one that kind of matches up with how it's nested. And so its URL would be just list. So then URL parameters, you can do, raise your hand if you're familiar with URL parameters typically in any other sort of idea space. All right, so this should make sense then. There's two ways you can do it. The second way is really used for regex. So you can say, for example, here's an example how you do hexadecimals. And you want to keep those simple because those are ultimately wrapped in other regex groups. So you really don't want to use any groups in there, and just more simple sort of regex. Maybe Nate can enlighten us later there. And then query parameters as well. So if you put a question mark, then you can specify using ampersand as many as you want, separate with an ampersand, and then it'll accept those as well. And those aren't going to be mandatory. Those are optional sort of parameters when you go to that URL. I don't think so. But we have a really cool feature coming where you're going to be able to encode and decode parameters and write your own custom encoders and decoders. So you could encode a parameter to an object and then decode that object back to a parameter. No highlighting makes bad visuals. So basically, the URL here, I'm kind of using an example of every type of parameter. ID, type, and then here's a regex, and then there's some query parameters after that. If I were to navigate to users123/details/nothing/0, then my state params will come back as this. And it's going to put type as empty because that was a mandatory parameter, and technically you fulfilled it. You just fulfilled it with nothing, null, or empty string here. Everything's a string. Also notice that the numbers are strings. But it did not add the query parameters to the object because those are optional. I just got your tweet. The internet is so fast. So then here's another one where I specify basically the same thing. I just fill in everything, and you can see it filled in everything. So now this is what the state params will look like. So that's for you to use as you see fit, and that should feel very familiar to you, but I didn't want to leave it out. But there's two caveats that have to do with UI router, and that is, and actually, no, the first one is the same even in NGRoute. So it's only, the state params object is only populated when the state is actually activated and all the dependencies are resolved. So So if you need, and the reason I say this is just in case you need to use state params in your resolve functions, maybe you need to load something based off of a parameter, you don't have access to that new state params yet because you haven't transitioned yet. It hasn't made that object reliable for you to use. So you use state.current.params instead. So you inject state instead of state params, and then use current.params. In state controllers, maybe I will turn up Nate just in case he wants to. Nate, I'm going to turn you up in case you want to correct me ever.
Yeah, sure. So we're actually introducing remember that transition object?
Right?
That's actually going to fix this caveat with state params. So you'll
Okay.
be able to see the to and from states and to and from parameters when you're doing a transition.
Oh, cool. Great.
So that's coming in a subsequent version, probably like a month or two out.
Okay. But am I right that state.current.params is the current way you would do it?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. So then number two, in state controllers, so if you were to inject state params into a controller of a state, it's going to only have objects in that object that are related to that state. So it's going to trim it down. And I have an example here. So up in this state, I have a URL that has one param, contact ID, and when I inject state params, ID exists, or contact ID exists. Now here in subitem, it only declares item ID. So if I were to try to access contact ID, it's not going to exist down here. And this is, I think, a technical restriction because of the way that states are encapsulated. Is that right, Nate? No, I'm just going to keep asking Nate everything. Nate, help! Or do you have no idea?
It's kind of a scoping issue. Well, I mean, it was done for scoping reasons, so that states only got the parameters that they knew about.
Right.
But
'Cause
the
Um,
parents were parameters from the parents. So wouldn't contact ID be available to somebody?
in other regards, like when you transition to something, the inherit comes into play because you don't have to pass every parameter. It's going to inherit in that regard, but it's not going to inherit in this regard when you use state params.
So would you use one way around that to set the URL as an absolute URL and include the contact ID?
Yep. If you really need access to it, I'm sure you could use
Or just
multiple ways. Yep, you could do that as well. You could use a service to pass it in. You could just pass.
You pass that parameter to data, and I can reuse it back in the shop if I wanted to.
Yep,
The data.
I think so. Yeah, if I understand what you're talking about, yeah. All right, so that's kind of a caveat, and that's a gotcha. So I wanted to include that in there. All right, so multiple named views, and we're all. Oh my God, this is such a long presentation. All right, so pros. They provide flexibility. You can have multiple views in any template. The way I've seen them used, where I can absolutely recommend them to be used, because it's kind of ambiguous when to use them. But the one way I know you should use them is for singleton type of components that live at the top level or somewhere sort of permanently. So like a side panel that will pop out, or a modal that pops up, or a tooltip, or a hint. Something that's at the top level that you want to say, hey, every time I go to a state, everyone is just going to tell that UI view to change out some content up here. So imagine you had like this is a bad example, but like your company logo. Every state you went to, no matter how nested it was, you wanted to give that state the ability to swap the company logo. And it lives at the very root. So they can tell that to do that, and I'll show you how. Yep, you target it. There's a targeting language that we have. You basically say the view name at the state that it lives in, and you can target any view.
Now, for example, we have a recruiters app, a company where we're about different colleges, they wanted the logo for colleges. Not expecting to go through the budget now, where we select different college, go back up and update whatever college logo is in that portion.
As long as it was in the same like app, meaning you one initial payload, and you still want that feature, then yeah. But if you're just swapping it out for one person and they'll always see the same app. You probably just want to do that.
We just want the rest of the content of that column.
Right.
But we also want to be able to change
That this would be like absolutely perfect for that. So yeah, and a lot of people put it to great use, but a lot of people use it very wrong, and it's often unnecessary actually. So you should try to nest things first. It's the leading cause of confusion, at least early on, before I modified the docs with like 14 warnings, and then it can lead to.
I'm gonna fix it soon, I promise.
Yeah, Nate is actually working on a new view service that's going to help out quite a bit. So actually, let me go through, Nate, let me go through this set of slides showing the anti-pattern that happens, and then I'll let you talk real briefly about kind of what you're coming out with.
Sure.
All right, so a quick concept, which I've already kind of told you a few times. There's this implicit root state that's always active that lives at the top, very top of your app. And this is kind of the config that I copied out of the the UI router code. It's got no name. Its URL is basically absolute root, and it's abstract. And then most important, its template, in quotes, because it's not really specifying, is your index.html, or whatever your top level HTML is. And there was probably a reason why I had to tell you that. So then here's a good use case example of why you might use multi-named views. So let's say you have your index.html, then you have sort of your main app off here. I kind of made it smaller, but imagine this is where everything's pretty much happening. It's all your main stuff going on. You can call that UI view main. You specify that with UI view equals main on the div. And then over here you have another UI view, and it's going to be a side nav sort of navigation that pops out. And you want to change it based off navigating to different substates. So what you notice is that they share the same parent, and in this case it's the root state, and then AKA the template that they're living in is index.html. And so this could be any sort of top level thing like I was talking about, a tooltip, a modal, a notification. And don't get me wrong, this is not the only use case for multiple named views. The problem is they're just so powerful and flexible that people use them wrong, very wrong. And this is one way to do it. And if you take nothing else from this portion, it's just be careful when you use them. So you have to name your views if you have more than one living at the same level, because how is it going to know which one to talk to? Or you can do it just if you want to, if you prefer to target by name. So when you configure multiple views, you use the views object. And now you still put some things at the top of the config object. For example, URL is still defined up here. But the keys are going to be your view names, and then the values are going to be the view config objects. So this one's going to target the main at the root, and then side nav at the root. And then you're going to configure it. So view names, I'm going to talk about the view name and the configure object separately. So you can use relative or absolute naming. Now this has nothing to do with relative or absolute URLs or transitioning, but it's yet another idea of using relative and absolute. So relative, it's that sort of always populating the parent. So when I just say main, that's kind of relative if you think about it, because I didn't tell it exactly what view. I just said main, and it goes, okay, well, you're talking about the parent template, the main view that lives in the parent template. If I say empty, okay, that's the unnamed view that lives in the parent template, and that's typically you're going to use unnamed views, but if you're going to be targeting them, you're probably going to want to give them a name. But just to show you that if you don't, you can use an empty string to target unnamed views. So then absolute, you use a at symbol. So this example, so remember, I'm going to go up here, this orange right here, this is where I'm talking about these examples going. So if I put list at contacts in there, it's going to know to configure the list view that lives in the contact states template. Does that make sense? The list UI view that lives in the contact states template. And this is why Nate's going to write a new view service. So then another thing is maybe I say list at nothing. So this is actually going to target, when you put nothing on the right side of the at symbol, that's targeting the root state. So that's targeting the list view in index.html. When nothing is on the left side, that's the unnamed view in context state. So pop quiz. What do you think this targets? You guys are listening. Index.html, but it's fine.
Yeah, it's basically to swap the parent and the child around in that respect between the parents, then the dot and the child. Now you put the child and the
We're just trying to make you have to think.
parent.
So then the view config object. So each view can have its own template, controller, and resolve. So those are the only three that it accepts, as far as I know. That's all I've written guides about, at least. And so you can, when I say template, I mean template, template URL, template provider. When I say controller, I also mean controller provider. These things are available to you. And then resolve is just resolve. All right, so another use case, and we're going to kind of step through it. So this is an app that I was working on, and this is a report page, and I have some filters at the top. So they're going to set those drop downs at the very top and hit run report, and then it's going to populate a table and a graph to the right. So we kind of think about, there's a potential anti-pattern I could run into here, and the first thing you might want to do is just split everything into like a quadrant and put them in their own UI view. And this might be a really bad approach for you. And I'm not saying for sure, and that's why anti-patterns kind of suck, is because they're so ambiguous. But I've kind of built in some questions to ask yourself. So instead of just putting a filters UI view and a table UI view and a graph UI view, let's ask ourselves some questions, consider some things. So what quadrants are dependent on other quadrants? So if I find, oh, this one really needs this one to sort of draw itself. It relies on this one doing something. So what you want to do is you want to nest the dependent ones and the parent ones, and that's kind of self-explanatory. So then are the multiple quadrants that are dependent, are there multiple quadrants dependent on the same parent? Okay, in our example, yes, there's the graph and the table. Those kind of rely on what the filters are set to. All right, so do those quadrants really need to be separated into separate UI views? And that's not clear cut. Well, can they share the same scope? I think in my application, yes, they could. They're, the same data that's drawing a table could easily draw my graph. It's plenty of data. So then maybe have them share a single view as well and nest that within the filters view. Okay, well, on the flip side, maybe those two things need encapsulation, maybe an unshared scope for some reason. If yes, then also give them multiple named views. So we're going to walk through that again with some graphics. So who's dependent on who? Well, does any quadrant depend on a single parent? Yes, table and graph depend on filters, so nest those. So here I've moved them into filters. Everyone sees that? And then, okay, do they really need to be separated? In my case, no. So I could merge them. Unfortunately, I didn't use Angular on that project. I wish I would have. And this is, I think, the way I would have gone with that. And this is totally opposite what I tell you to do in the in-depth guide, which I need to go fix.
So why does that mean that that's just like that?
You wouldn't have to anymore. All right, this is, I think, the last real thing, the real section. It's pretty quick. So abstract states. An abstract state, if you say abstract true on the config, it's a state that cannot be explicitly activated. So if you try to activate it via transitioning to it, it will throw an exception. But it can have child states, and then the way, basically it's to provide commonalities to children. So maybe I have one template that I need to load before any of these people are loaded. Instead of putting that template multiple times in all these children, I just put it in the parent but it's always going to be activated. It's implicitly activated when one of the descendants are activated. And you can do all kinds of things as listed here. I think I'm just going to gloss over this because it's really kind of for you to, I think, learn on your own at this point. I'm sure there's a lot to take in. But you can do basically anything a normal state can do as long as you know you can't activate it directly. All right, so real quick, so that's basically it. This is sort of just finishing up, thank God. And then, so the popularity has been pretty staggering, actually. We had no idea this was going to be so popular. And Nate and Karsten and myself, we tried to do our best to handle all the things that are coming in, like the issues. And we have 1,375 stargazers. That was last night. It literally went up by 20 stars in a day, and I had to check it. But all these numbers went up. So 142 watchers, 260 forks, 39 sporks. Thank you. My wife typed that in, and she was like, "Ooh." I'm like, that's so dumb. I was like, no, actually, that's pretty funny. I'll keep that. And we've been making waves in core. So Angular 1.2 moves route into its own module. And in the video where they mention that, they immediately follow it up with because of third-party things like UI router. I don't know any other third-party router. I don't know about you, but I guess they're probably homemade routers in most cases. This is the only one that's really open source being provided to the general public. And then there's kind of this rumor that maybe eventually it'll be included in core. I kind of doubt that because I think it's getting a little too complicated, but I would definitely see them ripping off the ideas and pulling them into the core. More love for UI router, ng boilerplate. The seed project uses it now. The next Yauman generator is going to be based off ng boilerplate potentially if they ever get around to doing it. And so you could see it sort of working its way into everything. Challenges, we're only in version 0.2. We've got lots of issues coming in and being fixed all simultaneously. We close way more than are open, as you can see. We also have a very small team and a lot of things we want to do. So if you're at all interested in using it, please log issues as you find them. It will help immensely. I would use it. Lots of people are using it. You might run into some edge case bugs. Again, just submit a new issue. Features we want to work on are a view service, basically decoupling view functions into their own service so you can just basically, it's like a ng include on steroids. You can just populate any view anywhere and you have the nesting built right in, things like that. You know what, Nate? I never let you talk earlier. Why don't you talk about this page?
All right. If we take any questions, you're going to have to repeat it back to me because I can't hear the audience very well.
Okay.
But yeah, so briefly about the future. The view service is actually written. There are just a couple of little spots in the test suite where it's not fully passing yet, and it needs to be used and like exercised a little bit more. But that will be dropping in 0.3, hopefully this week or next if I can get the time to do it. Typed parameters is actually going to be a really huge thing because right now all the values and state params that you match in your URLs are just strings. So type parameters are not only going to give you the ability to encode and decode from like an object down to a value and back, but it will also allow you to specify a value as being dynamic, which means that when the value changes, it'll change automatically in the URL, and those changes will be propagated to anywhere else that is subscribed to those values on the state parameters without reloading any states, as well as some other interesting features.
Now, would you say the big ideas, future goals I have listed there, those are like the biggest, craziest ones?
Yeah, orthogonal views is something that I honestly haven't given too much thought to. Like, it comes up occasionally.
That's
But
basically
yeah,
like two separate state trees, and somehow we have no idea
right.
how do we get the URL to represent these two sort of separate things happening. So that's why we just keep.
Right. And honestly, I think once we have the ability to take a set of components from a third-party library, or take a set of states from a third-party library and hang them off a part of the tree in our application, which is basically how componentization would work, that will probably solve the orthogonal view issue for most people.
Okay. And then components like reusable sort of leaf tree.
Right, so that's what I was saying, where if you
Okay.
have a set of states from a third-party library, you can um, have some syntax to specify where to hang them off of your own application state tree.
It's awesome.
That will probably accomplish that. Hooks for lazy loading states we actually have, and that will, like, it's not ideal, but it solves the use case, and that'll be dropping in 0.3 as well.
Okay. What is that?
That's where if you're trying to transition to a state that doesn't exist,
Oh,
it
right.
will raise an event, and you have the ability to intercept that event and load some other JavaScript.
Right. Okay. State not found.
Yeah,
All right. And thanks to EA Hutchins for that one.
yeah.
All right. Cool. So then this is sort of the last slide. The facts are that your app is not flat, so your router should not be. Your app is not rigid, so your router should not be. And states are better than URLs. Oh, snap. And I feel strongly that this will be the de facto router, and if not this, something just incredibly similar. You know, maybe me and Nate don't feel like continuing to do this for free for everyone forever. But whoever picks it up, they'll probably mirror this quite a bit. And that's it. So now it's Q&A, and I think we have about 10 minutes, or really I can stick around for however long. So anyone have any questions? Or y'all just want to leave?
I've got another bottle of beer here, so I'm good.
That's really good.
All right. We don't have any questions. We touched every
None.
possible corner of knowledge.
So now everybody's going to go out and use this in all of their Angular apps from now on, right?
Who, raise your hand if you think it looks like something you would use in your Angular app.
I'm already using it.
All right, awesome. Every single person raised their hand except for the guy in the
Sweet.
back. Screw you. Just kidding. I don't know. All right, so that's it. And thank you so much, Nate, for hopping on and clarifying things for me. And thank you so much for the library and continuing to support it.
Hey, I do what I can.
And
You're
the
welcome for the
pizza.
pizza. You're welcome for the pizza.
And I don't know if you saw this, Nate. Boom. All right.
It's
So
not,
thank you so much.
the screen's not. It's just,
Well, it's basically your big, huge logo.